Thank you for joining us again this morning. I will host a Zoom meeting this evening at 4 p.m. Central if you'd like to join us to talk about this topic. Before I start to go all Old Testament on the Republican Party's CPAC meeting, where this week they actually erected a golden statue of Donald Trump, and I and everybody else in North America immediately thought about the golden calf in Exodus, but I really do want to take just a minute to go back and talk about Exodus and the golden calf. If you look back into your Sunday school lessons at the book of Exodus, which heroically describes the escape of the Hebrews from bondage in Egypt and gives some accounting of their 40 years wandering in the wilderness as they prepared to militarily invade and occupy Palestine. Now, your Sunday school teacher may not have described it in quite that way, but look it up. That's what Exodus says happened. The biblical texts say that God gave them the land, but the subtext of that is that they first had to kill all of the Canaanites and Philistines who had been living there for a long time, which is sort of why Abraham Lincoln famously described America as being a new promised land when white Europeans escaped the economic slavery of Europe to come to these shores, taking a land given to us by virtue of us killing 90 million Native Americans who had lived here for several thousand years. Historically speaking, people always try to baptize genocide by saying that it was somehow God's idea. It never works on a small scale. If one of us climbed over the fence of one of our gated communities here and killed the inhabitants of one of the hotel-sized mansions we find there and just announced that God had given us that house along with the 3 Mercedes in the garage, we'd have a hard time selling that story. But note that the thousands of people who invaded our Capitol building on January 6th were not only shouting, "This is our house," but they carried with them crosses and big signs asking people to trust in Jesus. They also happened to have in their supplies a hangman's noose and building material for a gallows on which they intended to hang the former vice president, along with the current Speaker of the House and a few other leading government officials. They are seen here momentarily pausing in the ransacking of the Senate chambers to offer a prayer of thanksgiving to God who had given them the Capitol building after they killed a few people to get there. And they thoroughly intended to kill a few more to keep it, but they still saw it as a religious victory. All depends on who's telling the story, right? So the story in Exodus is that during their long sojourn in the wilderness, Moses goes up onto a mountain for a powwow with God, and he has simply gone too long, weeks even. So Moses' little brother, Aaron, gathers up everyone's gold jewelry and fashions a golden calf, and they begin to worship the calf until Moses shows up and breaks up the rage. Now let me give you a little bit of a backstory. All of these ancient Israelite narratives were first being put into written form while the Hebrews were slaves in Babylon in the 5th century BC. The Exodus presents itself as an account of something that had happened 500 years before they were writing it down. We have no substantive historical reason to assume that any part of the narrative in Exodus actually happened, right down to the existence of a liberating prophet named Moses, or that they had come out of Egypt in a massive slave revolt. We have no historical evidence that would make that a credible story. But it is a story that the Hebrew children told themselves as a story of their origin. It should not come as a surprise then to any of us who look at the historical context of these captive slaves in Babylon that they would write a religious narrative about how God had delivered them from slavery in a foreign land so that they could go and reclaim a homeland. With the least possible in-your-face affront to their Babylonian captors, the priests wrote about how Yahweh had delivered them from an entirely different captivity in an entirely different country long, long ago. I don't know if that little sleight of hand of literature actually tricked any of the Babylonians, but we still have the book, so maybe it did. So the images in the book are a blend of things from their cultural memory. The Semitic religion that became Judaism didn't start out as a monotheistic faith. The God of the Hebrews was considered to be a regional God, one among many in the world. The Psalms even reflect a certain cynicism about whether Yahweh could hear their hymns and prayers while they were captives in Babylon, since Yahweh, they traditionally believed, sat on a throne in the clouds above the city of Jerusalem. So there's a lot in the Old Testament about people allowing their loyalties to wander a bit, sometimes paying homage to Yahweh, but still hedging their bets by dabbling a little bit in the religions of their neighbors. The golden calf of this narrative in Exodus chapter 32 is a blending of several influences. Long before the Babylonian captivity, the Jews had divided into two nations, the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Yahweh was worshipped in the northern kingdom at an altar that had two golden calves. At the same time, the Phoenicians worshipped a fertility god that appeared as a bull and was called Baal, as did the Egyptians and many of the Babylonians. So the bull is, for lots of obvious reasons, not to mention the size of genitalia in a church sermon, but a bull represents fertility. A casual walk through the British Museum would give you a view of several ancient examples of this deity. What your Sunday school teacher may have failed to mention was that the veneration of a fertility god was usually a really sexy thing, involving both wine and orgies as part of the worship service. So you can imagine how Moses was not proud of his little brother's religious infidelity in this narrative, but the story embodies the ageless temptation of being pulled away from a spiritual life that calls for compassion, self-sacrifice, depth of character, concern for others, when the competing religion is a religion that encourages self-indulgence, drunkenness, greed, sexual license, and quite literally, a glorification of power. The priests who wrote Exodus realized that the majority of the Hebrew slaves had come to be rather acquiescent about being slaves. After 80 years of captivity in Babylon, 2, 3, 4 generations had grown up in slavery. Most of them were forgetting all about ever going back to their homeland. If you think about the end of the Civil War, when there was, at least on the surface of it, a generous offer to establish Liberia, a liberated state in Africa, and to send those slaves back, most of them had been born here for generations, and there was no sense to them of going back to a place they had never seen, whose language they did not speak, and where there was absolutely no way for them to know how to make a living in that context. So people who had been slaves for multiple generations in Babylon were being seduced by the religion of Babylon, which did represent power. They were the conquering superpower of the region, wealth plus sexuality, and military conquest. Having said that, I suspect that most of you now could probably finish this sermon without me saying another word. On Thursday of this past week, I delivered a lecture to a group of progressive clergy and laity in England via Zoom, which I can tell you is not my favorite way of delivering lectures in England, but right now they don't really want American company in person. But one of the incredulous questions I received from our friends on the other side of the pond was one that we've been asking ourselves for the last 3 or 4 years. Why have evangelical Christians remained so faithful in their support of Donald Trump when he seems, on the surface of it, to contradict absolutely everything that those evangelical Christians have been telling us that they believe in? And therein lies the rub. Everything they say they believe in. Sanctity of life, fidelity in marriage, honesty, a repudiation of greed, of arrogance, of crime, and of violence. But that is just what they say they believe in. Trump does not stand for any of that, but he does stand for what they actually believe in. Military power, wealth, greed, white supremacy, American nationalism, the oppression of women, along with the oppression of blacks, immigrants, brown people, whether they're from Egypt or Mexico, and certainly anyone that inflames their insecurity about their own sexual orientation. Trump affirms what evangelicals really believe in, and that is why they melted down their jewelry and erected a golden statue of Trump at their political rally to prepare for their 2022 and 2024 elections. The only thing that surprises me is that all these evangelicals appear to have forgotten all of their Sunday school lessons, to the point that people that haven't been to church for generations immediately thought of the golden calf in the Exodus narrative as soon as they saw this golden statue. It simply could not have been missed. But I want to thank CPAC, which I've never done before, for giving me a perfect sermon illustration. I only wish that I could have delivered this sermon on Friday morning before everyone else in the world hit exactly the same note that I'm hitting. Many of us have been nearly apoplectic about the unwavering support that Trump has received from right-wing religion, to include many American Catholics, which has got to be an uneasy alliance between Catholics and conservative evangelicals, especially since they were all just so outraged by Bill Clinton having a sexual dalliance with an aide who had, by her own reporting, gotten a job as an aide in order to have sexual relations with a powerful person. Their Puritan values were on full display in the mid-1990s, weren't they? But there really was never anything about sex or even perjury in their opposition to Bill Clinton. It was really all about power. It was obvious to most of us in the mid-1990s. It should be obvious to everyone now, in that whatever sexual dalliances or predatory behaviors that Bill Clinton engaged in, he was an amateur compared to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's dalliances do not appear to interest this group of evangelicals in the least. More than 20 years ago now, conservative columnist and evangelical pastor Cal Thomas and the late Ed Dobson wrote this book, Blinded by Might, about how the moral majority had come into existence in order to elect Ronald Reagan, but what they got back out of the deal was largely a lot of photo ops in the Oval Office. 20 years after the Reagan Revolution, this pair acknowledged that their movement had simply been seduced by power. They said they wanted to claim America for Christ, but what they did was claim America for the Republican agenda of tax cuts for the wealthy, military dominance of the world, and the repression of, if not the imprisoning of, black and brown people. Evangelicals, when they helped elect Trump, got some anti-abortion Supreme Court appointments, but mostly what they got was the rhetoric of white supremacy, of racism, of misogyny, of homophobia, and of xenophobia. They didn't get a president who was sympathetic with the values of Christianity. They got a president who was supportive of what evangelicals actually believe in: power. Power and white privilege and wealth hoarded almost exclusively by white men and a few basketball players, and the economic enslavement of minorities and women in lower-paying jobs and more menial labor. Note this week that we not only didn't get the $15 an hour minimum wage in the stimulus bill, but even as the stimulus bill existed, it did not get a single Republican vote, not one. And so why wouldn't you want full-time employees to have a living wage? And if you don't want them to have that, what is it you're really saying? It is a form of economic slavery. But Trump promised to build a wall. I don't think the wall between Mexico and the United States was ever the point. The real wall that Trump was busy building was an economic wall between the children of the poor and the colleges and universities that are the only way those children have out of poverty. Only through professional education and a chance at a better career do we actually break down the economic divide in the United States. And so over the last few years, we've done everything possible to make that more unaffordable and less likely to be accessible to the children of the poor. Now, folks, I know that I am ready for the Trump era to just be over. I'm so done with him. I'm ready to write sermons that never mention his name again. I'm ready to move on to solve problems that have plagued our nation long before Trump's immigrant family came to these shores. But nearly a half of our peers have now made an idol out of Trump and the social id that he represents. You have to recognize that Trump really represents the dark shadow of our civilization. And we just can't pretend that we can shrug our shoulders and move on without dealing with that shadow that is cast over us. I remember attending a lecture given by the famous psychiatrist and author M. Scott Peck, 35 years ago, actually, when I was living in Louisville, Kentucky. One line from that lecture echoes in my skull. In fact, it echoes so much that now if you Google this sentence, you will find it leading you to me rather than to Scott Peck, from whom it came. But he said, anything that cannot be questioned is an idol, and all idols are slated for destruction. Last month, Trump loyalists, at Trump's beckoning, stormed the Capitol building to stop the constitutional validation of the November election, in which Trump clearly lost by millions of votes and many electoral votes. They killed people. They desecrated the sanctuary of democracy. And they believed that this violent victory would end in Trump sending in the National Guard to finish the job of overthrowing the government. I don't doubt that Trump really wanted them to. Reports are that Trump was confused why his aides were not as jubilant about the riot on the Capitol as he was. He had actually convinced himself that by some miracle he was going to remain in office after losing the election. And yet, even now, his supporters will not give up on the white privilege he represents, and they have ignorantly put up this golden calf this weekend, and they are encouraging one another in their idolatrous worship of what amounts to a worship of themselves, or at least their darkest and most evil instincts. Even Missouri's own junior senator, Josh Hawley, returned to CPAC this weekend and bragged about his role in negating the November election, as if he would much prefer to be a traitor than to be an American senator. Folks, many of our peers, even members of our own families, have been seduced by a false idol. But as Scott Peck said, and I think he's right, all idols are slated for destruction. Because when you turn on the lights, when you question their values, when you really consider what they're saying, it all falls apart. There is no defense for it. I had hoped that my brother and other people that I have loved and cared about would figure this out on their own, and that I could move on to speak only of the future. I still look forward to that. I really do. Realistically, however, we have to bury the idol of American white privilege, of racism, of greed, of oppression, and military violence. We have to bury that idol before we can enter our promised land. About 20 years ago, I was a part of a demonstration at our local state university. I was one of many voices demanding that they change their employment policy to extend non-discrimination protection to their gay and lesbian faculty. The ardently Roman Catholic president of the university at the time flatly refused, right in the face of hundreds of us who were calling for this change. And the university trustees felt compelled to back him in his decision to defend prejudice as a university policy. Former mayor of Springfield, who was one of those trustees, explained to me that a university trustee has one job. When they come, they ask, should we fire the president? And if the answer to that is no, then the only other thing left for them to do is to support the president no matter what. So while every one of the trustees knew that the president was wrong, they were not prepared to fire him. So at the time, they supported him. But in the closing moments of the meeting, I stood up and told the university president, I know that you believe that you have won this issue, but the truth is, you have already lost. We are right, and you are wrong, and all that stands between the present moment and the civil rights of gay and lesbian faculty members on this university is just a little bit of time, just a little more time, and you'll be gone, and you will be nothing but a memory that embarrasses this university for its stubborn insistence on prejudice. America is not yet the shining city on the hill that our founders dreamed of, but all that is left is a little more time. White supremacy will not last because it cannot last. Confederate monuments are already disappearing across our landscape. We will have a living wage. America will have universal health care. We will have a compassionate immigration policy. In very truth, we have already won. We've not won because we're larger in numbers or because we've used violence or coercion. We have won because our cause is just, and we are on the right side of history. We're just waiting for our sisters and brothers to catch up to the inevitable.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.